Welcome back. We're continuing on, and now we're going to talk about scoring of rubrics 2 and 3. You'll notice that I put these two together for this slide, and that's because I always score these at the same time, and I'll explain why. So this one, going out to our rubric progressions document, this one is all about planning to support the varied student learning needs. That's Rubric 2. And the question for Rubric 2 is, how does the candidate use knowledge of his or her students to target support for students' literacy learning? And then I actually score number 3 first, because the topic of number 3 is using the knowledge of your students to inform your teaching and learning. And the question is, how does the candidate use the knowledge of his or her students to justify instructional plans? So to me, Rubric 3 is about explaining what you know about your students, and Rubric 2 is about explaining how you use that knowledge to develop your lesson plans and to support your students in specific ways. So bouncing back here, if you take a look at Rubric 2, you can see from a level 4 to 5, this one does have an automatic one if you don't talk about your students with IEPs and 504 plans. But you can see how this goes from a level 1 to a 5. Looking at the level 3 where we start, your supports are tied to your learning objectives and the central focus, with attention to the characteristics of your class as a whole. And going up a level, you can see that your supports address the needs of specific individuals or groups with similar needs. And then a level 5, I'm not even going to talk about. And the Rubric 3, it doesn't have an IEP or 504 level 1 automatic, but it does have deficit view. So if you talk about your students' backgrounds from a deficit lens, talking about their needs as things that are deficiencies or things that are errors or are bad for them, or you blame their parents for everything in their lives, that's a deficit lens, you'll get an automatic 1. At a level 3, you're justifying why the learning tasks that you've planned or your adaptations are appropriate, using examples from your students' prior learning or their personal, cultural, and community assets. And we'll break that down. You're also able to make a connection to research or theory in this one, but it might be a tenuous connection or it might be a superficial connection. You're not going super deep. Like, theory and research doesn't frame your whole justification for why you planned the way that you did. Okay, so auto 1, blaming your students for their struggles, having a deficit lens, that will get you an automatic 1. Okay, so let's take a look at the rubric progression document. We're going to start with Rubric 3, and the concepts you need to know for this one are deficit thinking, which we've already talked about. You also have to know what prior academic learning is. That is exactly what it sounds like, what your students have previously done in their academic learning. And then assets. Assets are their personal, cultural, and community elements that you're using in your planning, and we'll look more at that for Rubric 2. The primary source of evidence for this is your planning commentary prompts 2 and 3. And you'll see on Rubric 2 that the planning commentary prompts 2 and 3 are also the primary sources of evidence. So it makes sense to look at both of these rubrics at the same time. So level 3 on this, this rubric has primary criterion and secondary. So primary, you must always have at a minimum the primary criteria to get this level. So the primary criterion for this one is justifying your plans using the knowledge of your students' prior academic learning and or their assets. That's absolutely necessary. You have to have that. The secondary criteria that may help you to bump your level, but if the secondary criteria is not as strong or is really, really strong, but the primary criteria is weak, your score is based primarily on Criterion 1. So you have to have that first and foremost. And if you have the secondary criteria, that's what can kind of bump your score up a level. So the primary criterion for level 3, you are able to explain how the learning tasks are explicitly connected. So the things that you've planned are explicitly connected to your students' prior academic knowledge or your knowledge of the student's assets. And by assets, they mean their personal, cultural, and community assets that they bring to your classroom. This includes their cultural and linguistic backgrounds. If you know you've got a lot of students who come from a particular background and that's why you planned your lessons, their interests, if your whole class is suddenly very interested in something and you plan your lessons around that intentionally, their community or family resources, if you know you've got a whole bunch of people in your class who are using a community resource and you decide you're going to plan your lessons around that, and then their personal experiences. So that's the primary criteria you take into account. Most people are talking about their students' prior academic knowledge, and that will bring you in at a level 3. The secondary criteria here is your reference to research or theory in relation to why you planned the supports that you plan for your students. And here you are really just kind of mentioning the theory. You may or may not have a strong connection to your instructional design. It really is like, I used Vygotsky because I know that students learn by doing, and my students are going to do a task in this lesson. It's there, but it's not the foundational reason for why you developed your lesson plans. If your evidence meets the primary criterion at a level 3, the rubric is scored at a level 3, no matter what happens with your secondary criteria. So if you are here on this rubric, that is the highest your score will ever be able to be. If your evidence meets the primary criteria of the level 4, but you don't have the secondary criteria, you don't have a connection to the research, you will also score at a level 3. So these two criteria are helping to develop your score. Let's take a look at the level 4. So above a level 3, your justification not only uses the knowledge of your students, both as academic learners and as individuals, but you're also using research and theory. So you're more connected in your research and theories. You're not just saying, I use social cultural theory, period. You're able to make explicit connections between the learning tasks and the examples you provide and the theory. So your evidence includes specific examples from your students' prior learning and your knowledge of them. What they mean here is literal specific examples. This is one of those situations where you've got to read between the lines of what they're asking. They're not just saying, I know that previously in a lesson, I taught my students about summarizing, so I know they're ready to synthesize. That is just a casual mention of it from your knowledge of what you plan. A specific example would be, I just finished teaching the students about summarizing, and I had 90% of them score really high on the final unit assessment that I gave. I used that as a foundation for planning the synthesizing unit. I knew they were ready because I had collected data from the previous lesson. That is specific. That is actually giving examples from their prior learning. You could also talk about very specific cultural or personal or interests that your students have in their assets. Then you've got to explicitly connect between the learning tasks that you've planned and those examples that you provided. You've got to explain how the research you referenced is being used in your planning decision. And you must meet the primary criteria of the level 4, and at least make a fleeting relevant reference to research or theory. And that the secondary criteria could be at a level 3 here in order to score a 4, as long as your first criteria is super strong. Okay, so let's look at the student sample. And right now, we're going to just pause and please read the students' responses to prompts 2 and 3. So they span several pages. It's quite a bit. Prompt 3 is quite long. So stop right now and read and focus on the things that we looked at in rubric 3. Okay, once you come on back, we'll take a look at what the student wrote, and I'll also explain how these responses were structured. So the first question is one that has that box for IEPs and 504s. If you don't address this, you will get an automatic 1 on rubric 2. So for each of the prompts, describe what you know about your students with respect to the central focus. Consider your IEPs and 504s. We've got them in this class. Don't forget about them. So prompt 2A, prior academic learning and prerequisite skills related to the central focus. Cite evidence of what your students know, what they can do, and what they are still learning. So this is where they want you to talk about what is in your prior knowledge of your students. For your Inch 390 class, you are making this up. You don't know because this is an imaginary class. Make up what would logically come just before what you planned your lessons in. So you're going to see this student is going to talk about what came just before synthesizing. So students should have knowledge about government. She's going to start with social studies. They know about law. They know about power, authority, governance, according to New York State. Using this information, they should have some knowledge about slavery and equality of African Americans. Previously, we read about slave trade in the US, so they know about specific individuals and some of the terminology. So they started with the social studies content. And then, sorry, I tapped too hard. Regarding the central focus of comprehension and the strategy of synthesizing, previously students learned to summarize, and they have learned to close read and to make text to self, text to text, text to world connections. All of these are prerequisite skills to synthesize. They're ready for this more sophisticated strategy. The evidence I have, this is key. You can't just say, I know they're ready because I taught it. They want to know what's your evidence. It says super clearly, cite evidence of what they know. What is your evidence? The evidence I have that they know how to summarize, close read, and make text connections comes from a previous unit of study. At the end of the unit, all of them were able to write short summaries of text and did it at a mastery level. So this person collected some data. This is all fictitious. They didn't do this. They made this up. That is okay. In your student teaching, you will not make it up. You will talk about what they previously learned. Similar assessments in the close reading and text connections units showed me that they had mastered those skills. So this person thought, what do they need in order to synthesize? They have to be able to summarize. They have to be able to make text connections. They have to be able to master all of the prerequisite skills. So they just made up some units and talked about how they were able to do that. These students are still learning. So notice in bold, we've got students have knowledge about, which is what they know. The evidence I have for what they know is the students are still learning. So they're going through each of the things that they're being asked in the prompt. So this evidence, the students and others are still learning to identify key details. For example, in one of the students' summary paragraphs, this is what you should all be doing. Notice she's including a direct quote that shows that the students are still learning. This is citing that specific evidence. This is what bumps you up to the next category on the rubric. So for example, one student's summary paragraph, he wrote, one key detail was that the slave ships were often more than 2 levels. This is a key detail because it's pretty interesting. This is completely made up for Inch 390. You may do this. This shows that the student's able to refer to the text to find information, but still needs some support in figuring out what is key and what's a minor detail like the one he chose. Many students are still learning to identify key details. Support will be provided through modeling, using sticky notes, etc. Okay, so that's a very strong response. We see quotes, we see evidence, we see knowledge of what they know, what they're able to do, and what they're still learning. Super clear. Copy that structure. Here's the part where you talk about your students' personal, cultural, and community assets related to your central focus. What do you know about their everyday experiences, their cultural and language backgrounds and practices, and their interests? So this person writes that the class is primarily African-American students, and they speak a dialect of English at home as well as in school. Most students enjoy reading, but only if it's something that they find interesting. You can use your field placement classroom to kind of describe what the students are like. If the reading's not something that they find interesting, they tend to lose focus. Culturally, they come from African-American backgrounds and they're in an urban school where they're celebrating Black History Month. They're involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Every morning announcements are made during the month of February, featuring a strong person of color, their stories of injustice. They're comfortable talking about race and injustice due to biases. In the whole school, the teachers participate in ongoing restorative practice training, knowing that my students are deeply interested and personally impacted by this. I chose to design this unit. So this is a great rationale for designing a unit that is really meaningful in context as defined by the edTPA. I'm not sure that this one is super meaningful in context. Yes, they're reading compelling texts about African-American people, but it's not encouraging students to go out there and be change makers and use restorative practices. But anyway, the lesson teaches them important reading skills while also helping them to see that reading was a way for people of color to improve their lives, escape slavery, and gain freedom. Students will be invited to share their own experiences. So you can see how this person carefully chose texts related to the backgrounds of their students. This is a strong response. Okay, so we've got a sense of what the students learned, what their cultural, personal, and community assets and backgrounds are. Prompt 3 asks you to respond to support your justifications and refer to your instructional materials and lesson plans and use principles from research and theory to support your justifications of how you understand your students' prior knowledge, the things that you just described, and their personal backgrounds, the things that you just described from 2A and B, how this guided your choice or your adaptation of learning tasks and materials. You have to be explicit about the connections between the tasks and your students' prior academic learning, their assets, and research and theory. There's a lot packed into this. So notice the bold print where you can use as a frame what you're talking about. So this person starts by talking about schema theory. This is the idea that students add new information to their background knowledge and they accommodate or assimilate new information by asking students to think about vocabulary before they get the definition. I was able to form an idea of what was new to them, what information they previously had. So it's loose, it's there, there's some research there that it's fine. It's a good mention. It's not the foundational reason for developing the lessons. Following what they've learned previously, so there's that prior knowledge piece that's asked for right here, about the shift in assumptions about power and authority differing across place and time, I wanted to expand on that knowledge about how white Americans had most of the power in the past and how African Americans gained their rights. Culturally, because my students are African Americans and they can relate in some way to discrimination or inequality, I wanted to choose a book that allowed their cultural connections to be assets to their learning. So there's that connection to their assets, a good connection, by the way. I chose the text because not only did it have an interesting story, but it was also told from the viewpoint of an African American struggling to gain her freedom in a time of inequality. The story contained themes that were familiar to the students, fighting for equality, but also specific information about women's fight for freedom. This culturally responsive teaching comes from a social justice framework. Aha, where did they get that? which research has shown is effective for helping students of color to feel seen and heard in school. I chose for students to write a paragraph about how their perspective has changed because as fifth graders, they have a lot of experience writing paragraphs, and many of them will be able to connect with the idea of injustice. So for my students, learning something new that changes how they previously thought of an idea is something that they often struggle with seeing or admitting. By teaching them to use this graphic organizer and a question that refocuses their attention, I made the process simpler, while also challenging them to think about new information in a new light. It's a good answer. It's a strong answer. It does all the things that it needs to do. So then part B is describe and justify why your instructional strategies and plan supports are appropriate for the following groups: the whole class, individuals, and or groups of students with specific learning needs. And this is one that's got that automatic one. If you don't talk about your IEPs, 504s, language learners, struggling readers, you will get an auto 1. So the way I suggest you structure this response is exactly how this student did. You take these groups and you break them down into their individual paragraphs. So first, start with your whole class. These are your universal supports that you have planned for everyone in your class. This is the universal design. What did you do? You are all planning the gradual release of responsibility, which is shown by research to be effective in gradually releasing responsibility to your students till eventually they can independently do the task. And you can see how she has explained. The other whole class supports that a lot of you are going to use: anchor charts, the graphic organizer you're using. You're going to read aloud text to help your students decode, and just leaning in heavily on that modeling and thinking aloud. Those are the good universal things you're doing for everyone in your class, right? You can all write about that. Okay, next is talking about the groups of students who have specific learning needs. So, because there are multiple points where content, process, and product were modified to meet the needs, this is where students with IEPs are being addressed, because this person had, I think, 4 students with IEPs in the class and they all had similar needs. So they're going to talk about those specific learning needs of that group of students. The students with IEPs and those who are reading below grade level benefit from hearing information aloud multiple times, having additional time. The lessons are designed that the content's delivered orally as well as in print, and they have their own copy of the text. It's modified for students with IEPs or below grade level. They're able to work in a small group. They have a modified version of the graphic organizer that already has some elements filled in. The product of the written paragraph is modified for them. They can orally dictate. The rubric is modified for them. So we've got changes to the content, the process, and the product. This is where your accommodations and your modifications come in. Okay, so then you've got to talk about individual students. Who do you have in your class who has a specific individual need? Or how are you going to check in with your students kind of one-on-one? So this is like the whole group. These are your specific students, including those with IEPs, those with specific accommodations and needs. And then these are those one-off students who, when you're teaching, you see, oh, Johnny really needs my help right now. Johnny's really not getting this, whether they have an IEP or not. What will you do for those students? So for this one, you can see that individuals will be supported because there are several checkpoints for students to show how they are doing built into the design. So for example, every student gets to show on an exit ticket that they understand what synthesizing entails. I'm going to check each exit ticket and provide support as needed. They also get to work together in lesson 2. They could have peer support, they could have the teacher's support, they could stay with the whole group. There's a flexible delivery of content that is meant to support students individually. Also, this teacher is going to meet with pairs and groups, give immediate corrective feedback, and then as they apply the strategy independently, the teacher will have checked in to see that they're understanding with an exit ticket in the informal rubric, and will have provided individual support. The teacher's also planning to keep a checklist for those students who need that extra reminder of what to do as they're writing their paragraph. We saw that support that was meant to support individual students who need it. There are also multiple points through the 3 lessons for individual support, most of them built directly into the flow. This is an excellent answer. It's structured around the whole class, the specific needs, including those IEPs and 504s, and then individual students who you see need help. It's a strong answer. You should structure yours in the same way. Question C is a tricky one. We've already talked about this a little bit, but it's what are the common developmental approximations or misconceptions with your literacy central focus, and how are you going to address them? Remember that developmental approximations are thinking about developmentally, what are your children in your class able to do at that point? Think of the age markers as like developmental milestones. So in 5th grade, you're 11 or 12. What are you able to do in 5th grade developmentally, and what might be just out of their reach developmentally in regards to your lesson? And then common misconceptions relates more to, so developmental approximations relates to the student's cognitive and behavioral development, whereas common misconceptions really relates to their knowledge. What are they going to need extra support in understanding academically, because maybe they're not quite there yet. Synthesizing is a very sophisticated strategy for 5th graders. What might they have a hard time with? So this person already alluded to this a little bit, but a common misconception that they might not be able to do is, what is a key detail? We saw this in that prior knowledge section, what they're still learning to do. This is a great way to connect back to that. And then I'm going to make sure that I model finding a key detail and also explain my reasoning why it's a key detail. So not only is this person telling what the common misconception is, but also explaining how to fix it. So I've built in the use of a previous strategy using sticky notes to identify key details. This strategy was previously mastered. I'm going to bring it back. It's a great idea. You can copy the same sort of flow there. A common developmental approximation for 5th graders may have is that a change in perspective means that they think that their original idea was wrong. So if you have to change your perspective because you learned something new, sometimes children at this age feel bad about that. They feel guilty, or they feel like they were wrong before. This might discourage them from wanting to complete the assignment or for looking for that new information because they don't want to be wrong. To address this, I've made sure to model in lesson 1 that perspective is a way of looking at things, and there's a strategy for dealing with that. These are good ideas that this is the kind of writing you should do for this. Children around age 10 or 11 sometimes have a hard time adjusting their thinking without feeling guilty. Yes, she's just continuing. Okay, so that is responses to prompts 2 and 3, all of them. So let's go back to that rubric. So for rubric 3, remember we're doing them in their reverse order. I think that the candidate has explained how the learning tasks are explicitly connected to their prior knowledge or to their personal assets really well. We see what they previously learned. We see that quote from the student to show their learning. We even hear a little bit about their personal background. So I think the primary criterion is definitely met. We also see a good mention of research and theory. So I'm going to check out that level 4 again. At a level 4, evidence includes specific examples. Yep, she's got a quote, and knowledge of the students, and explains how the plans reflect this knowledge. I think this is happening. And then explicit connections between the learning tasks and the examples have been provided. She explicitly says that she knows that the students are still learning that key details strategy. That was the example she provided. So she's bringing it back, and she's going to make sure that she reintroduces that sticky note strategy. So that is an explicit connection between what's planned in this, and we see it in her lesson plans, and what she knows that they previously learned. And then the researcher theory informs the selection of design of at least one learning task. We see that she purposely chose text that would relate to the students' specific backgrounds as African Americans who may have experienced discrimination themselves. I think that this is a strong example of a 4. There are modifications for all levels. In addition to the IEP, she hit the IEPs. Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Using knowledge of students. This to me would be at a level 4. We see prior knowledge is cited. We see backgrounds explained. And we see a connection to theory. I would score this at a level 4. While we're still on this, let's take a look at Rubric 2. And this is again based on those same prompts. And this is the candidate's knowledge to support students in their literacy learning. So this is that whole class, individual, and group modifications or accommodations. And so this one is really focused on this prompt here. Prompt number, sorry, not this one. This prompt here, prompt number 3B with the modifications. So back to understanding rubric level progressions, go back up to a level 2. We see the guiding question. We see the primary sources of evidence. Your planned supports, this is defined, include your instructional strategies, the learning tasks and materials, other resources deliberately designed to facilitate student learning of the central focus. So at an automatic 1, you have not addressed your IEPs and 504s. We know that she's done this, and she's done this quite effectively. So at a level 3, you're explaining how your plan supports address the learning needs of the whole class while assisting them in achieving the learning objectives. You're addressing at least one of the requirements from your IEPs as described in your context for learning. We know that she's done this. Requirements must be explicitly addressed in the commentary and or the planning artifacts, the lesson plans, and it has to align back to that context for learning. We saw all kinds of modifications mentioned in the students' lesson plans all throughout. We see her mentioning, especially particularly down in lessons 2 and 3, we've got IEPs being mentioned, we've got accommodations being mentioned, and plus the modifications box. So we know it's in her lesson plans, and we also read it in the commentary description. So we know she's at least at a level 3. Let's check out that level 4. Above a 3, you're addressing specific student needs beyond those required, including scaffolding, structured instructional supports that are explicitly selected for individual students or groups with similar needs. We see that happening in this lesson with the anchor chart and the modeling and the gradual release of responsibility and the checklist and the vocabulary list. I think this is looking like a level 4. Explains how the supports are tied to the learning objectives intended to meet the specific needs of groups, whole class, provide more than one student. Instructional supports should be provided for more than one student, either more than one individual or for a specific group. For example, pre-teaching, providing a word bank. We see that happening. Differentiated instructional supports must be in addition to those with IEPs and 504s. So we know she met the IEPs and 504s, and we also know that she went a step further and did more for her students. And then at a level 5, your developmental approximations or misconceptions, you're responding to those directly in your lesson plan. So she does mention them and kind of addresses them with that key ideas thing. That's really not the foundation of the planning of this lesson. I would say she falls more into like just really good, universally designed and accommodating lesson plans that meet the needs of all of the students. So I would say this for me scores at a level 4, and it has modifications for all levels. This, remember, is rubric 2. Mods at all levels. IEPs are met. And then I would say developmental approximations or misconceptions are not foundational to planning. The whole planning was not based on those developmental approximations. They were just sort of mentioned casually, and it wasn't the foundational way that the planning happened. Okay, so that is rubrics 2 and 3 explained. Come on back for a description of rubric 4. Maybe it's time for a break. I think it's time for a break. I'm getting hoarse. So come on back for the next part.